Well, good morning, everyone. It's a real privilege to be with you. This is my first time at Southeastern, but I've already been made to feel very welcome in wonderful accommodation, and I'm looking forward to staying around here for a while. I'm going to be dashing off a little bit today to do other things, but I will be around some of the rest of the week and hope to get a chance to talk to you. Now, we're looking today and also tomorrow at the subject of moral objections to the Old Testament. And the reason I want to do that is because I think this is a major way that people are attacking the scriptures today. With the Old Testament, I think the objection often in the 19th century was it didn't happen. That seems to be almost presupposed nowadays, and yet if you try and make a defense about the historicity of the Old Testament, you'll find that you have to go in some quite obscure areas, and most people don't understand ancient history, so you can't actually make a link with people. On the other hand, most people intuitively feel that they are experts on subjects of morality, and so when they read about the Old Testament, they say, well, I read things and they don't seem to be very moral. Now, I'm hoping that my presentation is going to be coming up on the screen about now. Is that right? Well, are we okay there? Still working on the subject. It's there. Okay, and if I can have it in front of me, that would be even better. Great. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to look at moral objections to the Old Testament. And I want to begin with looking at the idea of trust. Because one of the big things that we have is, of course, a hermeneutic of suspicion, that many people are beginning towards the Old Testament with a subject where they don't really think that they can trust God. And the sorts of things that you're prepared to do when you trust someone already are very different from someone that you know nothing about. So my wife might ask me to do something without explaining. It might be a bit strange, but because I trust her, I found her trustworthy over the years, I will do that. On the other hand, if I get a random phone call from a stranger, I won't. And so I think that is a key issue. Another issue when we're looking at difficult questions could be the idea that God is so much greater than we are and we are so much smaller, and trying to think of the analogy of a small child and an adult. Now, the small child is a 3-year-old and they're playing in the park. They are having a great time, and the adult knows that it's good for that child to go to something else, to leave. They may be needing a meal, they may be going somewhere even better, or it may be simply it's good for them because they need to learn to obey their parents. I mean, there are all sorts of reasons that it might be good for them to leave. And so the adult, with their larger view of things, decides it's time to leave. At this point, the child throws a tantrum because the child feels that the adult does not have morally sufficient grounds in order to take them away. They survey the situation, and really they see no rational reason why they should give up the enjoyment they're currently having for that sort of very abstract, intangible future which the adult is inviting them to participate in. Now, what we can say in that situation is most of the children who are 3 don't actually doubt the benevolence of the parent at that point. They do protest, but they don't actually doubt the benevolence of the parent at that point. And I think that may be the situation that we can sometimes be in with difficult situations that occur in our lives. We may protest, we may feel great angst about it, but we can have a trust in God that isn't actually shaken by these tough situations. So that may seem a trivial analogy, but what we find is in the Old Testament, one of the main objections we're getting nowadays is the objection to violence in the Old Testament, and we're going to look at that today, and tomorrow we're going to look at this question of slavery. There is, of course, a big secular narrative of religion and violence being associated. We have the European wars of religion, we have the witch hunts, we have what went on in Northern Ireland, and then we have, more strikingly, the attacks of 9/11 and the Madrid bombing, London bombings, and so on, where a big narrative has grown up between the association of religion and violence. Now, this is a long-standing thing, and many secularists will see a whole way in which religion and violence have been associated, going back, and Christianity in particular, going back to the Crusades and so on. And by the way, that's why it would be a good idea for many secularists not to allow Christians into political office, because after all, they've got such a history of oppression, actually having them making some of the key decisions isn't going to be good for people's freedom. So that's how it makes sense to many secularists. And we need to be prepared to challenge that, and hopefully this is going to work. We have a number of so-called new atheists who've been making these attacks, and particularly Richard Dawkins and the late Christopher Hitchens from Britain, who are top left and bottom right. Also Sam Harris, bottom left, and to a lesser extent Daniel Dennett on the top right. Maybe I'm going to just use a signal. Is that better? Okay, here's a quotation from Dawkins. Some of you will know it. The God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. Well, we find out something about Richard Dawkins' library, that at least he has a thesaurus in it. And we see the sort of approach he's taking. Now, of course, when we come across another culture, and the Old Testament in particular, we find that there are a number of ways in which it doesn't seem to align. We have the natural strangeness of another culture. If you come to my culture, you will find some things strange. I will have to say that when I come to your culture, I find something strange. I won't say which. That's not really appropriate. But the point is, we have, when we're dealing with the Bible, not only another culture, but we have another time as well. Often when you've spent time in a culture, the logic of the way that culture does it makes far more sense. Initially, you just think it's bizarre. And when we look at other cultures, we always tend to look at them thinking of our culture as better. When we look at other time periods, we tend to think of our time period as better. And we also find it very hard to question the assumptions of our culture, because the assumptions of our culture are actually built into the language that we use. The very words that we use often encode cultural assumptions. So if we can just do that, is it? Okay, fine. So the objection can come, how can God command the destruction of 7 nations? What about the poor innocent children? Isn't that genocide? And, I think quite pressingly, if God could tell those people in the Old Testament back then to kill people, why can't he tell you? Isn't that just like the suicide bombers? So that you can see is quite a forcible objection. Is there a little delay on this? Is that the way it works? I don't know. We'll find out. Anyway. So people are making an equation between religious terrorism on the one hand and the sort of genocide that you get sometimes, situations like Rwanda on the other hand. So the Old Testament is associated with 2 very nasty things. Now, I want to try and give a multifaceted, partial reply to this. I don't want to say that I can take away the problem, but the reason an atheist often finds difficulty here, or many people find a difficulty here, is because there are a number of different points in their thinking that need to be realigned. So here is just one of a number of factors. One of the factors is actually an atheist believes that they're in a different universe from the universe that the Christians believe they're in. So if we take, for instance, the figures of Tom and Jerry, one of the things you may notice if you watch Tom and Jerry is that different physical laws apply in their universe. Have you ever observed that? And so what you find is that certain things that might be done by Tom unto Jerry or by Jerry unto Tom will actually be reversed in quite a short time. The reason many of us who are parents are prepared to let our children watch this sort of thing is because we believe that our children have sufficient discernment to be able to know that if they try this on their sibling, the same physical effects won't actually apply. And so we realize that they can make that distinction. Different physical laws apply. Or you could take another story, Disney's version of The Sorcerer's Apprentice. You chop a broom in half and it becomes 2. Now, one of the reasons we generally hold, intuitively, aside from biblical revelation, that stabbing someone is a bad idea is because it's painful for them and it tends to shorten their life. On the other hand, if stabbing someone gave them pleasure and lengthened their life, it might rather change the morality of stabbing someone. So the physical understanding you have of the universe can actually affect things. Now we take another story, which is the story of Genesis 22, when God tells Abraham to offer up his son Isaac. As an atheist reads this, they think, well, the problem with this story is that the only thing that a person has is their life. You take that away, and that's it. And we know from a Christian perspective that's not the case. So for God to take away Enoch's earthly existence wasn't a bad thing for Enoch. We also know that in this context, God has shown himself to be able to do remarkable things. And in the prior revelation given to Abraham already by the time we get to Genesis 22, we find that God has revealed to Abraham that through Isaac in particular, he's going to have future offspring. Now, at this point, Isaac hasn't had any children, and so Abraham has to know that Isaac is going to have some future existence beyond him sacrificing him, and that has to be a future existence involving having offspring. It's rather striking that he says to the servants at the bottom of the mountain, I and the boy will come back to you. So I don't need to read on to Hebrews and cheat and find the end of the story to find out that Abraham knew that God was able to raise him from the dead. I mean, I can get to where Hebrews got just on the basis of the Old Testament. In other words, in a miraculous universe where such things can happen, there may be certain things which within an atheist universe can't really work. Of course we can do the usual judo move with an atheist of saying, well, you know, where do you get your morality from? And you know about that reply, so I won't even bother using it. Now, what we can say is that that's just one factor, but the really big factor with any of these things is going to be the question of God's trustworthiness. And so that's what we need to look at. Now, my view on how we should know what's right and wrong is what might be called divine command theory. Many of you have done courses on this. That is, what God commands you is right, and so on. That's actually what makes right and wrong, God's command. Now, there is an objection that goes to that, which is said, well, doesn't that mean God can essentially call wrong right and right wrong? Actually, he can't. Because there's an infinite number of things that God can't do. That is, God is almighty, and that means he has the power to affect everything consistent with his character. That's what it means for him to be almighty, but that does not mean that he can make a God bigger than himself, or two gods bigger than himself, or three or four. That's how I get to infinity quite quickly, just keep on counting up. He can't make himself not exist for 5 seconds, and he can't lie, specifically said in the Bible, he can't lie. God can't just make wrong right. On the other hand, we do understand that in general life, there are things that you can do when you have authorization. I was in an airport recently with a disabled relative, and I was allowed into a bit of the airport that I'm not normally allowed into because I was with them, because I was with an authorized person. In other words, I could do something that would have been morally wrong for me to do if I'd not been with an authorized person. We know the situation in a company where someone does not have the authority to sign a check unless they're told by someone else. Suddenly, that signing of a check changes from being an immoral action to being a moral action, depending on whether they're giving due authority. So in the particular situation of taking someone's life, there is one person who is able to authorize the taking of life, and that is the author of all life. That doesn't mean God can tell you to do absolutely anything. God cannot tell you to worship Satan, because that is inconsistent with his character. But that does not mean that God can't tell you to do something that would have been immoral if he had not told you to do. Now, again, that can still sound quite risky. Many people don't want to make this defense because it sounds like you're opening a really wide goal, soccer goal in this case, in order for the atheist to be able to score a goal into. I don't know how that would work. Maybe hockey. You've got hockey, I mean, ice hockey and so on. So that sounds too risky to open that. But what I want to do is then qualify it with God's character, because the more you find out about God's character, the more you realize this is not a big risk. So what we've got to do is think about God's character, someone who reveals himself as merciful, and how the Old Testament actually reveals his merciful action. So he's got a proven character, and humans can trust him. So let's have a look at that. When new atheists attack the Old Testament, typically they have two attacks that they launch at the same time, and I think this is jolly undecent. The point is this, that they attack the Old Testament in two ways. One is to say it didn't happen, and the other is to say it's unfair. Now, I'd want to respond by saying, if we're looking at the morality of a narrative, whether or not it happened is strictly irrelevant. I can have a view of the morality of the narrative of Harry Potter without believing in its historicity. I can simply look at it as a story. I can look at the morality of the Odyssey without believing it to be historical. I simply look at it as a story. If I'm going to look at the morality of the narrative of the Old Testament, I shouldn't be attacking a version of it that I've watered down by saying, well, some of the big historical claims didn't really happen. I need to treat the narrative with integrity. And that means when we look at it as a whole. So here we have Dawkins speaking about how he sees the narrative of the Old Testament in Joshua. The Bible story of Joshua's destruction of Jericho and the invasion of the Promised Land in general is morally indistinguishable from Hitler's invasion of Poland or Saddam Hussein's massacres of the Kurds and the Marsh Arabs. Or again, we see when Dawkins looks at this story, he sees a story in which God doesn't actually speak to people, because he doesn't believe in that. No miracles are performed, there's no massive exodus, and then characters are judged as if God hadn't actually told them to do something. In other words, he sort of waters down the historicity of the narrative, and then he attacks the remaining narrative. Now, I'd want to say that if we're going to judge the morality of a narrative, I need to treat the narrative with utter integrity, with all of its aspects. So when I take the narrative of the Old Testament, I begin at the beginning of the story. The beginning of the Old Testament has God making all life. God likes life. God does not have violence there in the beginning. And clearly that's the pattern he sets up. Now Dawkins might object, but I don't believe in God. But my response would be, but God is the biggest narrative character in the Old Testament. So even if you're an atheist, you still need to judge the morality of the story, treating God as a real character in the story. So I can't judge the morality of Odysseus in the Odyssey factoring out Athene, because I don't believe Athene exists. That's simply taking part of the narrative. I've got to treat Odysseus and his interactions with Athene as real when I'm looking at the morality of the narrative. Now, in this narrative, God is real and God gave everyone life. And then you look on to the end of the narrative, in terms of chronology, and there at the end of the narrative, we can see an ideal where the wolf dwells with the lamb, the leopard shall lie down with the young goat, and so on. In other words, the bookends of the narrative seem to give you God's pattern and his ideal. We then look at the narrative, and we find that in the narrative, strictly, when we're reading the story and not judging its historicity, we're simply just reading it with integrity, we see that the Canaanites are judged for their wickedness, not for their race. One evidence of that is the fact that Rahab, who is a Canaanite, is able to switch sides. In fact, she says that she's heard so much of what God has done, and all the people have heard so much of what God's done, and she's decided to change sides. Implying, by the way, that because she has heard what God has done and she's decided to change sides, that the others who had heard what God has done could also have decided to change sides, and they didn't. And it's not a racist narrative because, of course, when Israel commits the same sorts of sins, they likewise are driven from the land by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. According to the narrative, there are two texts in Joshua which tell you that the people in the land knew of the amazing things that God could do, and so they chose, nevertheless, to shut up Jericho and to resist. In other words, there was divine revelation to them. So that's what we can see about the Canaanites. And furthermore, according to the narrative, they were people who committed child sacrifice, as it says in Deuteronomy. Every abominable thing that the Lord hates, they've done for their gods. They even burn their sons and their daughters in the fire to their gods. And you could try and argue for some historicity to this, but that's a distraction to the argument. We then look at the role that Israel plays. And we could argue that Israel has a unique position as God's judicial representative in the story. In fact, we could argue that at no subsequent point was Israel ever God's judicial representative in the same way. So it really was a completely unique thing for a nation in a unique position historically. We can also say that the commands that were given to Joshua and to Moses were given in a very miraculous context. Of course, you have the greatest display of miracles in the entire Old Testament with the coming out from Egypt. You then have the pillar of fire, the pillar of cloud, and so on. And that means that in terms of epistemic warrant, in terms of the grounds that there are to believe that these commands really do come from God, we have a massive amount, and that's very different from the analogies that people sometimes like to make today, where people hear God's voice in their head, or where certain Islamic theologians get together and they decide on the basis of their exegesis that they can then attack random targets. That's very different from a situation in which God's voice booms to 603,550 men from the top of a mountain, authenticating this is really God's revelation of the Ten Commandments, authenticating the person of Moses, and so on. So in terms of epistemic warrant, we're dealing with a different level. We can also say that one of the strange things in the narrative is that concern to do something in a very limited and proportional way. One of the absences from the narrative is going and inflicting extra special pain on the Canaanites. There is, of course, the case of Adonai-Bezek, who had his thumbs and big toes cut off, but that's because he had done that to 70 kings. So in other words, he got what he'd already given to others. But what we find is the striking thing that when they go in and they conquer and they kill the kings of the nations, they want to take their bodies down from the tree by the end of the day in order not to break that rule that you should not hang up across a body on a tree through nightfall. And it's rather striking that we have that sort of concern going on there. They're not torturing these people and so on. If you got surrounded by the Assyrians, you weren't just worried that they would kill you, you were really worried about what they would do with you before they killed you. And we could say, and this is a what-if argument that the Bible doesn't actually use, but we could say, well, this command, if it had been fully put in place, would have put an end to Canaanite child sacrifice, and God might be able to do certain calculations. Of course, God can do certain calculations which work out future suffering. Now, we cannot use consequentialist justifications for what we do because we don't know the future, so we can't make those sorts of calculations. But actually, knowing the future can sometimes change what's morally okay. Let's say you go to the top of a hill on a road, you're driving along, and there's a car you want to pass in front of you. Now, in normal morality, you can't pass that car because you can't see over the summit of the hill. On the other hand, if you knew that the road had been cleared, or you had friends the other side who were signaling to you in some electronic way or something like that, what would be immoral otherwise becomes moral. Often, again, with a 3-year-old, they can enjoy being thrown up in the air. When my children were 3, I used to do that. And, they enjoy it. It's a moral action, provided you know you can catch them. If you don't know you can catch them, it becomes immoral. In other words, what's moral and immoral can change depending on future knowledge. Now let's factor in a God with all future knowledge. There may be things which he has morally sufficient grounds to do, which we can't possibly relate to because we don't know the future. So that is another part of the multifaceted answer. It's not that any one of these is conclusive, it's just that together they make up a picture where when someone says, this story in the Bible is morally indistinguishable from that modern atrocity, you want to say, actually, we have so many different factors that make it different. We could also say that according to the narrative, God reveals himself as with an asymmetry in relation to mercy and wrath, and that means wrath in your language, doesn't it? Anger. The point is he's merciful, quick to be merciful, and slow to anger. Is that just a claim in the narrative? No, it's actually worked out in the narrative. That is, we find that hundreds of years before, to Abraham, he says, you're going to go into this land, or your descendants will go into this land, but they cannot go in yet because the iniquity of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. In other words, they're not yet bad enough. So he waited hundreds of years, and the fact that in the narrative he waits hundreds of years fits very much within the narrative, him claiming to be slow to anger. Also in the narrative, an atheist might easily miss this, God does most of the fighting. He's the one who makes the walls of Jericho collapse. When the armies are assembled against Joshua, most of them are killed by the hail that God sends. In other words, you can't just water down this narrative and make it a naturalistic narrative without really missing the main points. So someone might say, well, okay, that's just the way the Bible puts it, but the Bible is this sort of self-justificatory literature. It's trying to present Israel's side, and it's trying to make it sound really good. But actually, it can't be that. Do you know any other national literature that says as much bad about the people group from which it originates as Israel's national literature, the Old Testament? In fact, when we compare the most proverbially wicked nation or city in the Old Testament, that's Sodom in Genesis 19, and you know that story about, bring out your the men that we may know them, and Lot, righteous, says, "Oh, here are my two virgin daughters." There's a very similar story, isn't there, when you go on to Judges chapter 19, but this time it's Gibeah. It's one of Israel's own cities, and the point is that Gibeah has become as wicked as the most proverbially wicked city in the whole Old Testament. In fact, when you read on in the Old Testament, you find that Manasseh is practicing child sacrifice. He's described as doing worse than the Amorites. So in other words, as the narrative goes on, it's not that Israel is portrayed as being really good. In fact, it's going to be driven into exile because of its wickedness. We can also say that when people want to claim that the Bible makes other people kill others today, that we can say, no, we realize that people, when they read the Bible, recognize the distinction. Now, there are times in the earth where people read the Bible and they do things that on the grounds of what they believe they have read, which are not morally justified. But that can't really be blamed on the literature. If they were reading it properly, they should realize that no group has the same unique judicial position as God's judicial representative as Israel did. Again, they should recognize the difference between their own situation and that very miraculously attested Old Testament situation. So normal readers should know that what they're reading about is completely different from all modern wars. Therefore, when people want to say that there's a basic analogy between the Old Testament and modern religious terrorism and genocide, I'd want to say actually there are multiple differences. When they want to equate Joshua and Hitler and Saddam, we find, if we can just keep the next 7 slides through, we find that there are just many differences which distinguish those two things. There may be many more differences, but the point is this, that when people say this is morally indistinguishable, together they make up a picture that just makes you say, well, this is very different. Then we can say, when people make an objection, they're often wanting to draw an analogy. The point is, God telling people to kill people in the Old Testament, and people having religiously motivated terrorism and killing people today. And those can look superficially similar. But many times, things that look superficially similar can be morally worlds apart. So take someone who takes someone's limb off. You can have that going on in Sierra Leone in a terrible massacre, and that's a moral abomination, and you can have someone taking someone's limb off as a caring surgeon doing everything they can to help that person. So superficially similar, someone taking someone's limb off, a human taking someone's limb off. On the other hand, morally worlds apart. Which objection, in fact, are people making? It seems to me there are only really 2 valid objections to the morality of the narrative. One is the objection that it was immoral for God to command the destruction of the Canaanites. Of course, then I need to be able to show that there could be no possible morally sufficient ground for an all-knowing God to command what he had commanded in the Old Testament. And you realize that, of course, the level of proof that you're going to have to demonstrate there is pretty high. So to show that the author of all life could not possibly command that is very unreasonable. On the other hand, you might want to maintain that it was immoral for the Israelites to obey such a command if it really had been given the way the Bible describes. But of course, the Israelites had experienced God's faithfulness. They knew him to be good, and it came with a huge amount of epistemic warrant. Would you, in fact, convict the Israelites of a crime in that situation if you were in the jury? Maybe you would, and we can discuss that maybe sometime later in the week. There could be another objection, and this would be the simple objection that reading the narrative makes people do immoral things. The problem of this is that you need to bring forth empirical data showing that it actually does. And it also might prove too much, because if I could, for instance, show that reading Dawkins's God delusion caused someone to do something bad, then would that also show that his God delusion was a bad thing? Or if I could show, for instance, a classic book like Darwin's Origin of the Species led some people to infer from that they could develop a master race and genocide and so on. Can I then impugn Charles Darwin with great immorality on that basis? Now, some Christian apologists would go there, but I might just want to say, let's have a truce. That is, you want to say blame a book for bad things that people do having read it, why don't we just have a truce? I mean, I could probably make a pretty good case that so many more good things come from reading the Bible than any bad things that people do after reading the Bible. I could make a case for the greater good moral effect of the Bible than any other book. So we could go there, but I'm not a historian, so I just would draw a truce because I can't really handle the subsequent effects of what the Bible, what's been done in the Bible, because I think you need a good training on that. But my point is this: 3 objections. It was immoral for God, it was immoral for the Israelites, or there's an immoral effect. And I don't think any of those really stand up. But this is, I think, arguably the most awkward question people can ask of the entire Old Testament. I don't think I've answered it, but I think we can at least show that it's not a defeater. And the fact that it's not a defeater should give us a lot of grounds for trusting. Because when people ask questions, I usually want to ask them one of 2 things. Is this your most difficult question, or is this your most important question? Because those are really the only 2 questions we're interested in dealing with. And the most difficult question, if you can say, well, if I can answer the most difficult question, are you prepared to accept that all the other questions you have could be answered? Because if you can answer the most difficult question, that should be the status, logically, of the rest. So I'd want to say the fact that we can make at least a reasonable attempt at this most difficult question means that there aren't really moral defeaters in the Old Testament. Thank you very much. Well, good morning, and thank you to those of you who've decided to come back. What I want us to do is look at the subject of slavery, and I want to begin with a quotation from a well-known atheist writer in the US, atheist Sam Harris, who wrote the book Letter to a Christian Nation. So that's letter to you guys, I suppose. And this is what he says: in assessing the moral wisdom of the Bible, it's useful to consider moral questions that have been solved to everyone's satisfaction. Consider the question of slavery. The entire civilized world now agrees that slavery is an abomination. What moral instruction do we get from the God of Abraham on this subject? Consult the Bible and you'll discover that the creator of the universe clearly expects us to keep slaves. Now you can see the slightly weaseling verb expects there in the last line, and you can say, well, there we have the way he's trying to move us from perhaps allowing something to expecting and so on. But that would be unfair to deal with Sam Harris like that, because he goes on then to quote the Bible. The very next thing he quotes from the Revised Standard Version is this passage. As for your male and female slaves whom you may have, you may buy male and female slaves from among the nations that are round about you. You may also buy from among the strangers who sojourn with you and their families that are with you, who have been born in your land, and they may be your property. You may bequeath them to your sons after you to inherit as a possession forever. You may make slaves of them, but over your brethren, the people of Israel, you shall not rule one over another with harshness. So you can see that text, and it's a very important text, I would say, of all of the texts in the whole Bible. If you want to find the text that's going to be most seemingly pro-slavery, this would be the text to go to. And so here Sam Harris is quoting the Bible, and that makes it more awkward. We can disagree with Sam Harris, but this is the Bible, so we can't disagree with that, can we? Now what we need to see is that there are a number of words here that make us feel uncomfortable. The word slaves, we find, the word, no, these arrows aren't going to align because it's been made 16 by 9. So I'm going to just have to show you where they're going to have to go. Slaves, spy, property, and possession. Oh no, this is not good. Let's move on. Okay, there is a problem. What's the problem? The problem is this, that Bible translations talk about slaves. In the Old Testament, no objection is made to having slaves. In the New Testament, Christians are not commanded to free their slaves. In fact, slaves are told to submit. Therefore, biblical texts approve of slavery. We know that slavery is wrong. Therefore, biblical texts approve of something that is wrong. So you see the argument. Now, does anyone feel the force of that? Anyone at all out there feel the force of this? I know it's morning. Does anyone out there feel the force of the argument? No one out there. 1 or 2 nods. Okay. So hopefully, since you're in a college which espouses biblical truth, You're feeling uncomfortable at this stage because here we have a problem and you're hoping desperately there's going to be some deliverance from the problem. Well, let's look at the subject of translation to begin with. Just look at the terms that are being used. One of the striking things about the use of the word slave is there's been an immense rise in the occurrence of the word slave in English translations. Go back to the old King James translation of 1611, and you find that they only had one occurrence of this word in the Old Testament, one in the New Testament, and 5 in the apocryphal books. The one in the New Testament is translating the word soma in the book of Revelation, where it's clearly trading in bodies is disapproved of. And then we have an occurrence in Jeremiah 2. When we have the New King James translation revises that, we see it has more occurrences, the New International, New Revised Standard Version, yet more. Jewish Publication Society back in 1917 has just 3 occurrences of this word. When it comes to be revised in 1985, it has 135. Of course, that's just with the Old Testament. Go across to German translations and we find a similar pattern. The German equivalent word, the cognate word, in its masculine and feminine forms did not occur in the original Luther Bible nor in subsequent revisions up until 1912. Still no occurrences. But when that was revised in 1984, there are 70 occurrences. The Elberfelder even has 161 and 4 of the word slavery. We go to Spanish translations and we find a similar pattern. The Reina Valera translation in 1909 has just 4 occurrences of the masculine and feminine equivalents of this term, and by 1960 and 1995, considerably more, 25 and 65 occurrences respectively. This is generally happening in the Germanic and Romance languages, although the North Germanic, the Scandinavian languages, do something somewhat differently. We could go across to our Italian translations. The Diodati translation, the old one, has virtually no occurrences. The N.D.Odati, which is the new Diodati in the middle, standard Protestant translation, has about 100. The Jerusalem translation, the Catholic translation in Italian, actually I think scores an almost a European record in having close to 300 occurrences of this word, generally rendering the Hebrew word Eved, and so on. But I'm giving you occurrences, in this case, across the Old and New Testaments. Go to Afrikaans, which is a comparatively new language, but of course one where oppression is a very interesting narrative. And in the 6 left-hand columns, we have the Old Afrikaans translation for its Old Testament and its New Testament, and the masculine, feminine, and plural forms. In the 6 right-hand for you columns, we have the newer translations, and you can see a significant rise in the number of occurrences of these words. Now that's all very interesting, at least to me, maybe not to you, but what we can do is we can look at a text like Jeremiah 2:14, which is the one occurrence we have of this word slave in the Old Testament. And it goes like this: Is Israel a servant, using the Hebrew word eved? Is he a homeborn slave? And the Hebrew we have there is yalid bayit, born in a home, which really is the equivalent of homeborn. And the King James has in italics the word slave because there's no Hebrew original. The earliest versions of the King James actually use small print for the same thing. So the point is, the only time that you have the word slave in the King James Old Testament is when you need a B parallel form to be parallel to an A phrase. So in other words, when you've sort of run out of words and you need another one, you search around and find the word slave. Of course, the King James Version is just slightly before what seems to be North American slavery beginning, which might be put somewhere around 1619. So that has to be factored in. But Shakespeare uses the word slave a reasonable number of times. It was a word that could have been used, and it's a word that's pretty absent there. Contrast that translation with the New Revised Standard Version. The New Revised Standard Version is actually identical for this verse, but with one little difference, namely that the words slave and servant have been switched round. Now the word slave is the natural equivalent in people's minds of the word eved, and the word servant is the B word when you need to find an extra term. This can lead to some interesting inconsistencies. Take the logic of the RSV in Leviticus 25:42. talks about Israel as my servants of Ardai, plural of Eved, whom I brought out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as slaves. Now, why switch between two terms? Well, what's happened is people have liked to have this idea that Eved, which occurs 800 times in the Old Testament, basically has good occurrences and bad occurrences. So when we have Moses being the Eved Adonai, we like to say he's the servant of the Lord. On the other hand, when we have other occurrences, we tend to think of them as slave. And when we have an occurrence where someone is talking to a superior, they might well say, what does my Lord say to his Eved? And in that case, we just think it's servant and it's just politeness. Now, I'd want to say that I don't think there is actually that differentiation between good and bad Eved in the Old Testament. When we come to the rendering of these terms in the Pentateuch, in the Greek Pentateuch, the work of the 70 translators, we find that generally the word doulos does not occur. It occurs thrice in the Pentateuch, that's all. The words pais therapon and oiketes are more generally used. When we come to later portions of Greek translations of the Old Testament, and therefore we look at the so-called Septuagint as a whole, by the way, I think Septuagint is a very modern construct, really a 17th century idea, but we can come on to that if we like. If you want to discuss that afterwards, I'm very anti the idea that there is a Septuagint. But anyway, we'll use it for today. When we look at this so-called thing, we find that there's far more occurrences of doulos as a whole. But in the early, the first Greek books to be translated, namely the Pentateuch, it really wasn't occurring very much. And I think that's significant because there's a rise in the understanding of Eved in a more negative way as we get closer to the Roman Empire. Now, this word Eved is not, I believe, a negative term. Take the fact that Shema, who is the Eved of Jeroboam, is rather proud to be so. He's got his seal impression that you can see here, and I'm sure you can all read Paleo-Hebrew, so that's no problem. But there we have it on the second line, where he's the Eved. It's the three letters on the right on the second line, which give you the ayin beit dalet. So what we can say is this is something that's very positive. For Moses, the only time he gets called the Eved of God is once he's dead. It's something that's honorific. He gets it once, Moses, my servant, has died, and that's when he gets it. When does Joshua get called that? Once he's dead. It's something that's very striking and very rare to be allowed to be the Eved of God. It's a privileged position. So it's rather different from the word slave. One scholar who looked at the root ayin beit dalet in the Old Testament said it's a dynamic relational term. The one who is signified thereby is signified as dependent from the relation partner. That's really how we should say Eved always works. So it's not a term about oppression, nor is it a term about ownership, which is usually what our modern word slave is about. It's really a term of, it's a relational term. You have to be an Eved of someone. It implies that relation. It implies dependence. It implies subordination. And really, it's related more to arvad, the idea of working. So when we look at this term, although nowadays it gets translated both servant and slave, all English translations still render the majority of occurrences of this term as servant, and yet in certain cases they're using the word slave. I don't think it's inherently negative. You might want to say, well, isn't Eved avadim, servant of servants, slave of slaves, which is said of what Canaan will be in Genesis 9:25. Isn't that negative? Well, I think obviously it is, cursed be Canaan, but it's not that the term itself is inherently negative so much as when you're a subordinate of a subordinate, that becomes a pretty negative thing as a whole, but it's not that the term is just doing that negative work on its own. So it really relates to work and being subservient. And of course, everyone, including everyone in the whole society, is a servant of the king. Those who are under Saul are his servants. So we don't have yet the idea growing up of free people, independent, authority. That language of free person really begins probably with 5th century BC Athens. It would be a great PhD topic for someone to study, just the history of the notion of freedom, particularly how that develops in its early stages, because I think that's not really been considered very carefully. And of course, we have a very strong narrative of ourselves now being free, although of course when we're children, we're not free to run out in the road, we hope our parents will stop us, and also as adults, we tend to be not free to avoid taxes. So there we are. Let's look at the Old Testament institution then. When we look at the patriarchal system, the work that these people are doing is not working in cotton plantations in chains, but rather working as herdsmen, domestic servants. We find that Eliezer of Damascus, if Abraham doesn't manage to produce offspring, is going to be inheriting, as will the children of Bilhah and Zilpah, Jacob's second-tier wives. Of course, having second-tier wives is always a bad idea and always leads to domestic disputes, but that's another story. And what we find is that the children of Hagar, Bilhah, and Zilpah are free. Now, that would be rather different from in what the standard slave societies that you would consider. We have also to remember that when we're dealing with this stage in the Old Testament, that New World slavery hasn't happened. Greco-Roman slavery hasn't happened. So we need to make sure that we do factor out all of those sorts of things when we're considering the Old Testament. These people, in Abraham's case, are trusted to travel with valuables, hundreds of miles, 10 camels with valuables off to find a wife for Isaac, or they're given weapons in order to go and rescue Lot. One of the things slave societies don't generally do is arm the slaves. And it seems that there isn't really an approved selling of people. You might say that the phrase miknath kesef, that means acquired by silver in Genesis 17:12, which it refers to those that Abraham should circumcise in his household, implies that he actually paid silver in order to acquire people, and I think that's a valid point. But I think what we don't see here is the idea of tradesmen going around selling people. So when we compare what's going on in the Old Testament with what might be going on in the Roman world or in the New World slavery, we find a difference. In the Old Testament, of course, there is Sabbath for everyone, 1 day in 7. There's holiday. You have to look after people, you have to give them enough food. Legal redress, I think we can make a case that everyone had equal access to the city gate and to legal redress, which of course, when you're being kidnapped from West Africa, you do not get. Sexual protection, yes, there are very strong laws about that sort of thing. Sex can only be within marriage, and of course, when someone's married, that confers privileges. In the case of kidnapping is a capital offense. Chains, there are no mentions of chains in relation to servants or slaves in the Old Testament, but there is in the book of Ecclesiasticus. So we find that there's a striking difference there. With torture or physical abuse, again, that's absent, and if you so much as knock the tooth out of a servant or slave, you have to let them go free. Now, we can also look at runaway legislation in the Old Testament. This is what Deuteronomy says. You shall not give up to his master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall dwell with you in your midst in the place that he shall choose within one of your towns, wherever it suits him. Now, I should say here, I'm quoting from the English Standard Version, and I am on the committee of the English Standard Version, and I did make an attempt to make sure all occurrences of Eved were rendered consistently as servant. I don't mind if they're all rendered slave. I would just like them to be consistent. So if we have them slave, it would be, what does my slave say to his, what does my Lord say to his slave? Which isn't, which is quite strong language, I suppose. I think servant's probably a far easier word for us to understand. In the case of the antebellum South, we can also say that there were some pretty harsh penalties. Here's one I found, that failure to hand over an escaped slave would mean 6 months imprisonment and, what was harder still, an $1,000 fine when the dollar was really worth rather a lot. Now, when we think of selling and buying, which is language which is used in Leviticus 25, we do need to recognize that there is selling and buying of people's labor. But what is going on? I think one of the most common things that we have going on is actually debt slavery or servitude. Think of this. You're in a society, a subsistence society, where there is no social welfare. You become poor for whatever reason. Maybe your ox dies. You basically have no collateral. And you need food. Well, in that context, the Old Testament commands people to supply you with food. But maybe that charity runs out. Maybe they're pretty short of any spare food. And so what you can do, the only thing you can do, is you can pledge your future work. That's all you can do. And that is, of course, what I think is often going on in the Old Testament. People are pledging future work. And that would explain, of course, why corporal punishment of these people is allowed. You might say, well, using corporal punishment on an adult human doesn't seem like a very nice thing. But the point is this: if you say, well, give me food today and I'll work for you tomorrow, and then tomorrow you say, well, I'm not going to work, what else is there? So I'm not saying that this is a wonderful system. I'm simply saying that there is some logic to it. And what goes on in the Old Testament is essentially people sell themselves, or they sell their daughters. Now, when they sell their daughters, they're not trying to cash in on their daughters and see how many camels they can get for this beautiful young maid. Rather, what's going on is, you've got to remember that with marriages in those days, they used to have financial transactions, so that the groom would pay bride price to the bride's father, and the bride's father would pay the dowry to the wife. And of course, if the man cheats on the woman, he's going to lose access to that, and so on. So there was a new financial settlement in order to look after that new household. I do actually think that incorporating heavy financial penalties into marriages, and so, if someone cheats on someone else, the person cheated on gets to keep the castle or whatever. I think those are generally good things, and the lack of those in modern societies has not been positive. But what's really going on, I believe, is temporary leasing of people's work. There aren't salesmen and intermediaries talked about in the Bible. The one time, of course, when people do sell people is Joseph's brothers selling him, and that was bad. And bodies retain rights, of course, and there's a theology of God owning everything. Now, I need to go into a digression here about how people misread Exodus, because people typically see the book of Exodus as the liberation of Israel from slavery. Nothing could be further from the truth. You see, what the book of Exodus says is, well, I've got a typo there, but there we are. Exodus 13:3, we have Moses said to the people, "Remember this day in which you came out from Egypt, out of the house of slavery." That's the way it's typically rendered. But what it actually is Beit Avadim, the house of servants or slaves. But who are these servants or slaves? Well, Deuteronomy will talk about we were Eved of Pharaoh. But if we look just at the way the book of Exodus expresses it, it will express it rather differently. The way the book of Exodus portrays the oppression of the Israelites, it will talk not about them being slaves, but about how they were oppressed with heavy burdens ruthlessly, and it will occasionally, in some renderings, use the word slaves. But obviously in earlier renderings, such as the King James, this didn't happen. The main ways it expresses how bad this is by talking about bitter, hard service, including the word avodah, from Ayin Beit Dalet as a root. But what we see is rather a consistent avoidance of actually using the word Eved of the Israelites in Egypt. There isn't a slave-free contrast, that is, there's no language of liberation, there's language of bringing out of the Israelites from the land of Egypt. In fact, the people who are the Avadim in the book of Exodus are not the Israelites, but the Egyptians. You see all of these occurrences on the text. These are all of the occurrences when the Egyptians are said to be Pharaoh's Avadim. God says, I will send my judgments on Pharaoh and on his servants. The point is, who are his servants? The Israelites aren't his servants, they're God's son. They're God's servants, they're not Pharaoh's servants. Then we find that There is one occurrence where the Israelites are called Pharaoh's servants, and this is when the foreman of the Israelites, so the chief amongst the Israelites who are being oppressed, want to creep up to Pharaoh. And so they say this is actually them reporting to Moses, isn't it? But one time they say to Pharaoh, "We are your servants." This is the time they turn around and say to Moses, "The Lord look on you and judge, because you have made us to stink in the sight of Pharaoh and his servants," using that word avadim. So what we can say is actually the root ayin beit dalet occurs more for what the Israelites go to after they have left Egypt in the book of Exodus than what they go from. Because God says to Moses, go to Pharaoh and say, "Let my people go that they may serve me." Now, there is this tendency in some early translations, such as the Greek, to use the word latrio, which often comes out as worship, for that particular root. But I think let's try and keep the words together just at the moment and recognize that actually what they go to after they've been in Egypt is service. So we have more occurrences of that root, ayin beit dalet, for what they go to after leaving Egypt than what they had in Egypt. And there we have that God says to Moses, "You shall serve God on this mountain." So if I can just conclude on that, we can say that the Israelites were slaves in Egypt because from our modern categories, they were slaves in Egypt. We can also say that from the categories of Deuteronomy, they were slaves in Egypt. But from the categories of the book of Exodus alone, we actually find a rather different emphasis. We find that the emphasis is on how Israel is God's son and therefore free, and Israel is God's servant and doesn't therefore belong to Pharaoh. It's quite a striking thing. Now, that does rather affect liberation theology, by the way. You might notice I've just blown it up. But there we are. Let's go on to another subject. Now, in terms of the way we view slavery, one really helpful thing is to go back to the creation. We have here the beautiful woodcut, which was by Josiah Wedgwood, who was Charles Darwin's grandfather and a liberationist, "Am I not a man and a brother?" which I think is really inspired by this text from Job. "If I rejected the cause of my manservant or my maidservant when they brought a complaint against me, what then shall I do when God rises up? When he makes an inquiry, what shall I answer him? Did not he who made me in the womb make him? And did not one fashion us in the womb?" We can say that basically, when we go back to the very beginning, there is a sense of God making everyone and making them equal. Even when we consider Philip Schaff, who was in the position of not being abolitionist at the time of the Civil War, you know, the Ante-Nicene Fathers and so on, done by that great scholar. What he would say is that according to the Old Testament, the institution of involuntary and perpetual servitude dates from after the fall and first appears as a punishment and curse. And there you have the fact that the word radah, to have dominion over, is used, of course, in relationship between humans and animals before the fall, but it does not occur about human-human relationships till after the fall. And that's one of those words that occurs in our passage in Leviticus 25. Now, you might well still feel uncomfortable with what the Old Testament does, but here I think we can be helped by the distinction between permissive law and regulation. Sometimes what we have in the Old Testament is not saying this is good, but simply regulating this. How do we know? Well, go to what our Lord says on the question of divorce. He's asked about divorce, and he says, you are misreading the Torah. You are assuming that because Moses regulates something, he's actually approving of something. Now, just because some people draw up regulation about limiting gambling in a particular state or something like that does not mean they think gambling's a good idea. It simply means that they are seeking to regulate it. Now, if we apply Christ's hermeneutic to other topics and say, look at Moses, but then go back to the beginning and realize that the beginning is what gives us the pattern of how things should be, that will also help us on the subject of polygamy and on the subject of servitude. In the area of polygamy, we go back to the beginning, we see one man, one wife, and we find that as soon as people start having multiple wives, there are conflicts, whether it's in Abraham's family, Jacob's family, David's family, and so on. When we look at the question of servitude, we can also say before the fall, there is no dominion of one human over another. Even after the fall, the word which is said to the woman, interestingly, he shall rule over you, is the word marshal, which is less strong than the word radah, to have dominion. Now, someone might say, well, I accept that, but what about the New Testament? The New Testament is dealing with Greco-Roman slavery, which is obviously something different, and slaves are told to submit, and masters aren't told to free their slaves. So surely the New Testament approves of slavery. Well, of course, let's remember that at that time, Christians had no vote. So for Paul to spend his time writing, telling them what the ideal political system would be, somewhat like Plato might do in his Republic, wouldn't be a very helpful thing for most of the believers. In fact, if he encouraged slaves to rebel, they would be executed, rather like on the film Spartacus. But there are also limits, legal limits to the emancipation of slaves, and this is again a research topic I would like someone here to go and pursue. That is, there are laws which say you can only free a certain number of your slaves. So, for instance, if you free them on your deathbed, if you've got 30 slaves, you can only free a third of them. If you've got 3 slaves, you can only free 2. Or there are limits such as the Lex Aelia Sentia, which says that if you free someone under 30, then they can't become a Roman citizen without an awful lot of great difficulty. So what we can find is that simply to go and say free all your slaves wouldn't make them legally free necessarily. So there would be a danger there of conflict with the Roman system, just going off and freeing them and so on. We can also say that there are some further things in the New Testament. The emphasis on loving others as Christ loved us is a rather striking thing. Put that into practice, and really you will get a proper equality of treatment. Then the emphasis on brotherhood, that we are siblings, brothers and sisters, is a very striking thing. It would have been rather scandalous in the Roman world to be talking of people across social ranks in such sibling terminology. And rather than just it being a language game, what we find is that Christians put this into action with a vigorous kissing campaign. So it's not just that in Paul's letters you have the holy kiss, you also get it in 1 Peter. Now, one of the striking things about the holy kiss, some people like to say, well, that was part of their culture to greet each other with kisses. But hang on, was it part of their culture that Jew would kiss Gentile and that master would kiss slave? Surely not. Surely that would have been one of the most scandalous things to people of that day, that across these major boundaries, people are kissing each other. If you want to have an effective kissing campaign today, on campus or whatever, you need to start with the people you least want to kiss. The whole point of this is to break down those major barriers. And whom do you kiss? Actually, you kiss those who are your siblings, your family. That's what kissing is about, in case you want to know. Now, what we find is that we also have in Paul's letters, Ephesians and Colossians and so on, the emphasis on equality, that masters are to give ta'auta to their servants. Now, does that mean they're supposed to give the same things to each of their servants, or does it not rather mean they're to give to each of their servants the same as they give to themselves? If they're not even to threaten, well, they're certainly not to hit. They're told that God doesn't prefer masters. And again, we get the language of equality, isotes, used in Colossians 4. We find in the case of Philemon, do you say Philemon or something like that? Yeah? Whatever. You know the book. Where Paul says to Philemon that he is to accept Onesimus no longer as a slave, but above a slave as a beloved brother. So that idea of brother is really key. And then what do you need to do in order to be saved? Well, you know Romans 10 verse 9, don't you? You need to confess that Jesus is Lord. Jesus is Kurios. Jesus is Master. So the big watchword that's in all of their songs and everything like that is Jesus is Master. So the idea that Christians don't actually abolish slavery within the church is a rather odd idea, because every kurios has to realize that they themselves have a kurios. Everyone is under Christ, and everyone is both free from sin and a slave of Christ. Everyone was a slave of sin and free in regards to Christ. So in the church, you realize that these terms of slave and free are used universally of everyone, and the great thing about being a slave of Christ is it doesn't preclude you having the inheritance of a son, and so on. So all of these images come together. Now I want just to say a little bit about the trajectory hermeneutics. There was a significant book by William Webb called Slave Women and Homosexuals, in which he sought to make the argument that ran roughly like this. The Bible seems to approve of slavery, which is a premise I think I've tried to dispute. And yet we know that slavery is wrong because actually we have some hints in the Bible that set us on the right path, such as Galatians 3:28, there being neither slave nor free. So in other words, the biblical texts don't necessarily need to arrive where we should actually be. He then says, but that doesn't apply in the case of homosexual practice because we don't have hints that would set us on a path to say that's okay. But in the case of women's roles, the reason we should go to an egalitarian position is because there are hints that would set us on that path, such as Galatians 3:28. Now, one of the problems I have with this sort of trajectory, apart from the fact that I dispute the premise, which is that the biblical texts actually approve of slavery as currently defined, is actually there is a lack of control when you consider these sorts of things. Because the problem is, how can you tell what progress is unless you know what the end point is? How do you decide what higher principles are? How do you plot a graph often between 2 points? And what about alternative trajectories? So I just want to do a very quick reductio ad absurdum of trajectory hermeneutics, if you don't mind. Can you find a mistake in this argument? Let's start with the subject of sex. In the Old Testament, polygamy seems to be allowed. In the New Testament, you have only monogamy if you're going to be a church leader. And then by the time we get to people like Augustine, sex is basically bad. Well, that seems to me a trajectory. Who is to say that the end point is actually bad? It may be self-evidently bad to people today, but it wasn't self-evidently bad to most of the monastic movement. So in other words, there is this problem about how we decide what is better and what is worse. A slightly more absurd one, but you may enjoy it. In the Old Testament, women are allowed to speak. In the New Testament, women are told to be silent in churches. And why not have it, after the New Testament, women being silent in all situations? I mean, again, it's absurd, but the point is this. If we say that we have this trajectory, how do we decide what's good and bad? And this is where I think that some of that trajectory hermeneutic is problematic, because it actually has an outside idea of what is good, and that is then being imposed to spot progress in the biblical texts. And so there are certain ideas within Webb of seed ideas which then get developed later. But how can we tell the difference between a seed idea which is to be developed later and a throwback? There isn't a good control on that. Well, those are my thoughts I'd share with you today. It's been wonderful to be with you for these 2 lectures, and I encourage you to believe that there aren't really any defeating moral objections to the Old Testament. Thank you.